Racist billionaire's life changed after one. Look at this black woman who become his greatest treasure. Hello and welcome, dear viewers. I am Alcott Bryan, your storyteller, and I'm thrilled to have you here. This story you're about to experience is one filled with deep emotions, love, struggles, and triumphs. It's a journey of growth, redemption, and the power of transformation that we all can relate to, no matter where we come from or what we've been through. From the deepest moments of heartbreak to the sweetest moments of joy, this story has it all. The love between two people who have fought against the odds, the lessons learned through pain, and the ultimate victory of love over hate. You won't want to miss a single second. So, I humbly ask you to stay with us. Watch this story unfold until the very end. There are twists, turns, and revelations that will leave you captivated, inspired, and maybe even changed in ways you didn't expect. Thank you for choosing to be part of this journey. Let's dive in together. And remember, love is always worth the wait. Stay tuned, stay engaged, and enjoy the story. Alexander Knight sat in the back of his sleek black limousine, staring out at the flashing city lights of New York. The world beyond his window was alive with motion, but inside he was still, always still. His sharp, angular features and ice-blue eyes reflected the coldness that had been drilled into him from childhood. At 32, Alexander had everything a man could ever want: a billion-dollar empire built on ruthless business dealings, a penthouse overlooking the city, luxury cars that lined the garage of his mansion, and a reputation that commanded fear and respect. He was the CEO of Knight Corp, a company that had its hands in everything from real estate to technology, media to finance. The name Knight was synonymous with power. It was a name that could crush anyone who dared to challenge it, and Alexander wore it like a crown. Raised by his late father and his manipulative grandfather, both men who had instilled in him the cold, harsh values of white supremacy, Alexander's heart had long ago turned to stone. His father had taught him that the world was a battlefield, and the only way to survive was to rise above the so-called inferior races who were destined to fail. His grandfather, a man who had built the family fortune from the ground up, had only reinforced these beliefs, whispering in his ear about the inferiority of people of color and how they would always be below them, beneath them, in every sense of the word. It was a belief system that was deeply ingrained in his soul, shaping every decision he made, every interaction he had, and every business deal he closed. He never questioned it. To him, the world had always been divided. Those who had power and those who didn't. And those without power, well, they were simply irrelevant. So when his assistant had handed him the invitation to a charity event for inner-city children, he had rolled his eyes. He didn't care about the poor or the disadvantaged. It was all just a facade, a way for the rich to feel better about themselves while keeping the world's problems at arm's length. The only reason he agreed to go was because his PR team had insisted. His public image was important, and appearing at a charity event would bolster his reputation, paint him as a generous billionaire who cared about social causes. It was all smoke and mirrors, and he was perfectly content to play along. The night of the event, Alexander walked into the grand hall of the luxury hotel, his tailored suit sharp and crisp. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cologne, champagne, and the laughter of the elite. He made his way past the photographers who clicked away like drones, eager to capture his every move. He was used to the attention, the cameras, the admiring glances from women, the business deals waiting to be struck in every corner of the room. But as he passed through the ballroom, something caught his eye. A small group of children, mostly black, but some Hispanic, some Asian, were gathered around a young woman. She had braided hair that cascaded down her back like a river of night, and her smile was warm, genuine, something Alexander hadn't seen in a long time. She was talking to them, laughing, making them laugh. It was a sound that struck him like a chord, unfamiliar, and yet somehow comforting. He was drawn to her without knowing why, a magnetic pull that felt like a betrayal to everything he had been taught. She wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense, not in the way that the women he'd grown accustomed to were. She didn't have porcelain skin or platinum blonde hair. But there was something about her presence, her energy, that made her stand out among the sea of superficial, polished faces. As he watched her, she turned, and for a split second, their eyes met. His heart skipped, and he quickly dismissed the feeling. What was it? He couldn't place it, but it made his pulse quicken. She didn't flinch or look away, something most people did when they saw him, especially people like her. But she didn't seem to care. She wasn't intimidated by him. It unsettled him. She smiled again, a soft, knowing smile, and turned her attention back to the children, who were hanging on her every word. It was a moment that lasted only a few seconds, but it lingered in his mind long after. Alexander wasn't used to being captivated by anyone, let alone someone like her. He didn't even know her name, but he felt this strange compulsion to know more, and that terrified him. He had never allowed himself to care about people outside his carefully curated world. They were all just tools to him, employees, clients, rivals, nothing more. So why did this woman, this teacher, with her unassuming beauty and her laugh that seemed to cut through the cold of the room, make him feel something that made no sense? Something human. Something real. As the night wore on, he couldn't shake the image of her from his mind. His usual disinterest in events like this turned into something else entirely. He found himself walking towards the group of children and the woman, his gaze fixed on her, as if he couldn't stop himself. And as if fate had orchestrated it, she glanced up at him again, and this time their eyes held. Just for a moment. There was a recognition in her gaze, something that said she knew exactly who he was, but didn't care. That was what bothered him the most. She didn't care about him, and that, in its own strange way, made him want to know more about her. But he knew better than to make the first move. Alexander Knight didn't lower himself to chase after people. He didn't need to. But as he stood there, watching her, he realized that he couldn't let this moment go. Something had shifted inside him, something he couldn't explain, and he knew, deep down, that his life, his world, was about to change in a way he hadn't anticipated. In the cold, calculating world of Alexander Knight, where everything was predictable, this one small encounter had introduced an unknown variable, a spark that threatened to set everything aflame. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control, and he hated it. The days following that night were a blur for Alexander. His usually methodical, calculated life began to feel like it was slowly slipping out of his control. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of her smile haunted him. It wasn't that she was the most stunning woman he had ever seen, though she was undeniably beautiful in a way that felt raw and unrefined. It wasn't her features, but her presence, how she effortlessly commanded the room with a quiet grace, how she radiated warmth as if the world didn't have the power to freeze her soul. Selina Moore, a name he had to ask around to get, seemed untouched by the power and wealth that dominated his own existence. No, she wasn't a part of his world. She was everything he was not. That thought alone gnawed at him. It unsettled him in a way he didn't understand, and he hated it. It was a feeling that stirred something deep inside, something buried under years of bitterness and prejudice. And when he went to bed, her laughter, her warmth, her calmness echoed in his mind. Every sound, every fleeting moment of interaction became a thread that wound itself deeper into the tapestry of his thoughts. He tried to shake it off, to ignore the pull that had begun to tether him to her. After all, this was Selina Moore, just a community teacher among thousands in the city, a woman who came from nothing. But still, it lingered. It was something he had never known, that curiosity, that vulnerability, and it terrified him. The days bled into one another, and he found himself looking up her name, reading about her. She had worked as a volunteer for multiple youth centers, been involved in a number of social justice programs, and was known for writing blogs that spoke out on racial injustice, inequality, and the societal systems that kept people like her, like him, divided. But it wasn't just her activism that piqued his interest. It was the way she carried herself, how she spoke with such conviction, not as if she were above others, but as though her beliefs were a natural extension of who she was. And even more oddly, the way she seemed completely immune to the power he wielded. That was what shook him. She wasn't afraid of him. She didn't cower in awe of his success or his wealth like so many did. There was no hint of reverence in her eyes, no fluttering sigh of admiration when he walked into a room. Instead, there was something much more dangerous to him: respect. She respected herself, and in doing so, she challenged him to see the world differently. And that was terrifying. He found an excuse to attend another event. This one, however, was smaller and more intimate, a meeting with local educators. He knew, in some sick part of him, that he was seeking her out. He had convinced himself that it was purely for business. After all, Night Corp had donated millions to educational causes in the past. What harm could it do? What harm could it do to get closer to the woman who had, with just one look, begun to shatter his carefully constructed walls? He had to see her again. He had to find out who she was. The event itself was dull, a sea of meaningless conversations and fake smiles until she entered the room. Selina. She was wearing simple yet elegant clothes, a deep green blouse that brought out the richness of her dark skin, black slacks that moved gracefully with every step. Her hair, still in the braids he remembered, was pulled back into a neat bun, but it didn't take away from the radiance she emitted. She wasn't aware of the attention she drew as she spoke with a group of teachers. It wasn't the attention of the room she commanded. It was the attention of Alexander. His heart thudded in his chest as she approached the group he was mingling with. He tried to remain detached, to keep his eyes from following her every movement, but it was impossible. There was something about her, as if everything in his life had been a series of distractions until this moment. And now, nothing else seemed to matter. The way she moved through the space, the effortless ease with which she communicated her ideas, her passion for the children she fought for. It ignited something inside him. It reminded him of something he had long forgotten. The rawness of living for something more than money or status. She wasn't afraid to be real, to be vulnerable, to fight for something that could make a difference. How had he forgotten that? How had he become so cold? Selina didn't notice him at first. She was too busy speaking with one of the other organizers. But when her gaze met his, it was as if time paused. He could see the faint recognition in her eyes, the flicker of acknowledgement, like she had seen him before. It wasn't the terror he had often seen in others' eyes when they realized who he was. It was something else entirely. It was as if she saw him not for his wealth or his name, but for what he truly was beneath all of it. A man desperately trying to reconcile who he had been with, who he might still become. And in that single glance, something shifted in him. Something he couldn't control. Something that made him want to drop the armor he had worn for so long. The walls that he had built around himself, impenetrable and unyielding, began to crack, and he didn't know how to stop it. She excused herself from the conversation and approached him, her steps confident yet unhurried. The way she moved with purpose, as if every decision she made was a reflection of something larger than herself, left him stunned. She stopped just short of him, and for a moment they were silent. She didn't smile at him like the others did. There was no forced politeness. She simply looked at him with a calmness that, for the first time in years, unsettled him in the most profound way. "You're Alexander Knight, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. It wasn't a question meant to flatter. It was a statement, a simple acknowledgement of who he was. And yet, it felt like an accusation. "I've heard a lot about you." Her words hung in the air between them, thick with implication. It wasn't an accusation in the way others might have delivered it, a judgment. No, it was something deeper. It was as if she was challenging him to confront the man he had become, to question the legacy he had been handed. But she said nothing more, and the silence between them felt pregnant with meaning. Finally, Alexander broke it, his voice cold as he couldn't help but retreat behind the walls he had carefully constructed over the years. "I'm sure most of it's exaggerated," he replied, his voice distant, as though trying to keep her at arm's length. But she wasn't fooled. Her eyes, warm yet sharp, never wavered. "Maybe," she said simply. "But maybe the real question is, what do you want to be remembered for?" And in that one simple question, the ground beneath Alexander's feet seemed to shift, like the earth was pulling away from him. There it was, the question that would linger in the back of his mind for the days to come. What do I want to be remembered for? He couldn't answer it. Not now. Not yet. But he knew. He knew that something had changed inside of him. Selina Moore had cracked open something deep inside him, something he hadn't even known was there. And that scared him more than anything else ever had. He left the event that night with a mind in turmoil. His thoughts were a tangle of emotion, guilt, and longing. For the first time in his life, he questioned everything: his wealth, his empire, his beliefs. Could someone like him change? Could a man who had been so steeped in hatred and privilege ever truly redeem himself? And more importantly, could she, Selina Moore, be the catalyst for that change? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stop thinking about her, and that terrified him more than anything. The days after the charity event were a whirlwind of chaos for Alexander. His mind was no longer his own, consumed with thoughts of Selena Moore. He couldn't shake the image of her face, her calm and unflinching gaze, the way she had asked him that simple yet devastating question. "What do you want to be remembered for?" It had lingered in his mind like a poison, slowly creeping into every corner of his thoughts, forcing him to confront a truth he had never dared to acknowledge. Could he change? Could he truly evolve from the man he had been, cold, ruthless, calculating, and become someone who had purpose beyond wealth and power? The idea seemed ludicrous, but Selena had shaken something inside of him, something deep and raw, and that terrified him more than he cared to admit. But he couldn't just let it go. No, the obsession was too strong. There was something about her, something in the way she held herself with such confidence, such quiet strength, that made him want to be more than just the man he had been raised to be. And yet, he still didn't know why. Alexander had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life. But this was different. It was as though the moment she looked at him with that quiet, challenging gaze, a seed had been planted inside him, one that refused to die. He couldn't focus on work the same way anymore. He found himself staring at his laptop, his thoughts drifting away from mergers and acquisitions to that brief conversations with Selena. Every time he tried to push the thought of her aside, it came rushing back, louder and more insistent. He even found himself Googling her name again, reading more about her background, her community work, the blogs she wrote about social justice and inequality. And the more he read, the more he realized how little he truly knew about the world she inhabited, how ignorant he had been to the struggles of people like her. How had he allowed himself to live in a bubble of privilege for so long, blind to the pain and injustice that others faced every day? That was the day he made a decision. He would find her again. He didn't know how or why, but he couldn't just let this feeling, this pull toward her, continue to consume him. He had to see her, speak to her, understand her. And if she could challenge everything he had ever believed, maybe, just maybe, she could also teach him how to change. It was an irrational thought, but it was all he had. He called his assistant and arranged for another charity event. This time, it was a fundraiser for an underfunded inner-city school that Selena was known to support. He didn't care about the cause, not really. What mattered was that Selena would be there. He told himself that this was just another networking opportunity, another PR stunt to bolster his image. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The night of the event arrived, and Alexander found himself once again walking through the ornate doors of a luxurious ballroom, the crowd buzzing with the usual superficiality. He could already feel the weight of their gazes on him, their expectation, their judgment. But this time, he barely noticed. His eyes were scanning the room, searching for one person. And then, like a beacon cutting through the noise and chaos, he saw her. Selena. She was standing near a table of volunteers, engaged in a passionate conversation with a young woman, her hands animated as she spoke. Her hair, braided and neat, framed her face like a halo, and for a moment Alexander simply stood there, watching her. There was a sense of calm about her, a stillness in the midst of all the clamor, and it made him feel as though the room had quieted down. He wasn't used to feeling like this. He was used to being the center of attention, to people seeking his approval, bending to his will. But with Selina, it was different. She didn't look at him the way others did. There was no awe, no admiration. Instead, it was something else. She looked at him with the same intensity she reserved for everything she cared about, as though she saw him for who he truly was, not for his wealth or status. That thought made his stomach twist. What was it about her that made him feel so exposed? It took everything in him to approach her. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he couldn't just stand there any longer, watching her from a distance. As he walked toward her, he noticed the way she carried herself, her posture straight, her movements deliberate. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply existing in her own space, secure and unbothered by the world around her. It was both fascinating and infuriating to him. When she noticed him approaching, there was no flash of recognition in her eyes, no instant, forced politeness, no fake smile. She simply looked at him, her expression neutral but curious, as if she were waiting for him to speak first. For a moment, he hesitated. He was used to being the one in control, to making people bend to his will. But in this moment, he felt like a child standing before an adult. "Mr. Knight," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but there was an underlying strength to it that made him feel as though every word carried weight. "I didn't expect to see you here." He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the unease creeping into his chest. "I could say the same," he replied, his voice betraying none of the emotions that were roiling beneath the surface. He didn't know why, but being around her made him feel vulnerable in a way he had never experienced before. "It's a cause I'm interested in supporting." Selina raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Is that so?" she asked, her tone playful yet pointed, as though she were testing him. "Yes," he said, finding himself momentarily lost in her gaze. "I want to help." His words felt foreign in his mouth, like they didn't quite belong. He didn't know if he was lying or telling the truth. Maybe a little bit of both. She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though she were trying to gauge whether he was sincere. "I see." She didn't say anything more, but the silence between them felt heavy, laden with unspoken words. Finally, he broke it. "I've been reading some of your work," he admitted, and at that Selina looked surprised, though she didn't let it show for long. "Really?" she asked, her voice soft, but tinged with something that could have been curiosity or wariness. "What did you think?" He hesitated before responding. "It's thought-provoking." The words felt awkward, but they were the truth. Her writing had stirred something inside him, made him question the world he had lived in for so long. He didn't know how to express it without sounding like he was trying to justify his actions, but he needed to say something more. "I don't know much about the things you write about, but I want to learn. If you'll let me." Her expression softened ever so slightly, but she remained guarded. "And why should I let you?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them like a challenge. It wasn't harsh, but it was clear she wasn't ready to let him off the hook that easily. Alexander stood there, silently for a moment, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the way she was dissecting him, and he realized, with startling clarity, that this was the first time anyone had ever truly seen him. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, but him, the man beneath the suit, beneath the legacy. He couldn't answer her question. Not yet. But he knew this. Whatever he had to do, whatever it took, He wanted to find out more about her. And for the first time in his life, he wanted to be something different. Something better. The moment stretched on. But before he could speak, the conversation was interrupted by someone else, a colleague of hers, pulling her away. She glanced back at him, a flicker of something in her eyes. Whether it was approval or skepticism, he couldn't tell. But for the first time, Alexander Knight felt like he had just experienced something more real than any deal he had ever signed, more important than any transaction he had ever made. And it left him craving more. As Selina disappeared into the crowd, Alexander was left standing there, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he was doing, or where this strange pull toward her would lead. But he knew one thing. He couldn't turn back now. Something had changed. Something had awakened inside him, and he had no idea how to stop it. The days following the charity event felt like an endless cycle of tension and confusion for Alexander. He couldn't shake the feeling of being unsettled, a sense of something stirring deep inside him that he couldn't quite name. Selina had left him with more than just questions about the charity or about the causes she championed. It was as though she had seen through the mask he wore, seen him in a way that no one ever had. And yet she hadn't offered him the usual respect that others did. Instead, she had challenged him, forcing him to face himself, to reconsider everything he had built. The words she had spoken to him that night haunted him, echoing in the recesses of his mind. What do you want to be remembered for? She hadn't demanded an answer. She hadn't even expected one from him. But it didn't matter. Those words had burrowed into his soul, igniting a flicker of something he had long buried. Hope. Hope that he could be something more. He wanted to prove to himself that he was capable of change, that he wasn't just the product of his upbringing, his wealth, and his father's ideals, but the journey to self-discovery wasn't going to be easy. He couldn't just wake up and become someone else. And as much as it frustrated him to admit it, he knew that if there was anyone who could help him figure out who he could be, it was Selina. But how could he reach her? How could he make her see that he was trying to change, that he was trying to be better? For a few days, he did what he always did. Buried himself in work. His schedule was packed with meetings and business deals, but every moment in between, his thoughts strayed back to her, to Selina. He couldn't get her out of his mind. He would be sitting in his office, going over a report, and suddenly her face would flash in front of him. Her calm eyes, her unwavering confidence. Her presence seemed to fill every corner of his mind, as if she had become a constant companion, whether he wanted her there or not. He knew that he had to find a way to speak with her again. But this time, it couldn't just be a passing conversation. This time, he wanted to truly talk to her, to let her know that he was willing to listen, to learn. But how could he do that? She wasn't someone who would easily be swayed by his wealth or his status. She had mouth like they didn't quite belong. He didn't know if he was lying or telling the truth. Maybe a little bit of both. She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though she were trying to gauge whether he was sincere. I see. She didn't say anything more, but the silence between them felt heavy, laden with unspoken words. Finally, he broke it. I've been reading some of your work, he admitted, and at that Selina looked surprised, though she didn't let it show for long. Really? She asked, her voice soft, but tinged with something that could have been curiosity or wariness. "What did you think?" He hesitated before responding. "It's thought-provoking." The words felt awkward, but they were the truth. Her writing had stirred something inside him, made him question the world he had lived in for so long. He didn't know how to express it without sounding like he was trying to justify his actions, but he needed to say something more. "I don't know much about the things you write about, but I want to learn. If you'll let me." Her expression softened ever so slightly, but she remained guarded. "And why should I let you?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them like a challenge. It wasn't harsh, but it was clear she wasn't ready to let him off the hook that easily. Alexander stood there, silently for a moment, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the way she was dissecting him, and he realized, with startling clarity, that this was the first time anyone had ever truly seen him. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, but him, the man beneath the suit, beneath the legacy. He couldn't answer her question. Not yet. But he knew this. Whatever he had to do, whatever it took, he wanted to find out more about her. And for the first time in his life, he wanted to be something different. Something better. The moment stretched on. But before he could speak, the conversation was interrupted by someone else, a colleague of hers, pulling her away. She glanced back at him, a flicker of something in her eyes. Whether it was approval or skepticism, he couldn't tell. But for the first time, Alexander Knight felt like he had just experienced something more real than any deal he had ever signed, more important than any transaction he had ever made. And it left him craving more. As Selina disappeared into the crowd, Alexander was left standing there, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he was doing, or where this strange pull toward her would lead. But he knew one thing. He couldn't turn back now. Something had changed. Something had awakened inside him, and he had no idea how to stop it. The days following the charity event felt like an endless cycle of tension and confusion for Alexander. He couldn't shake the feeling of being unsettled, a sense of something stirring deep inside him that he couldn't quite name. Selina had left him with more than just questions about the charity or about the causes she championed. It was as though she had seen through the mask he wore, seen him in a way that no one ever had. And yet she hadn't offered him the usual respect that others did. Instead, she had challenged him, forcing him to face himself, to reconsider everything he had built. The words she had spoken to him that night haunted him, echoing in the recesses of his mind. "What do you want to be remembered for?" She hadn't demanded an answer. She hadn't even expected one from him. But it didn't matter. Those words had burrowed into his soul, igniting a flicker of something he had long buried. Hope. Hope that he could be something more. He wanted to prove to himself that he was capable of change, that he wasn't just the product of his upbringing, his wealth, and his father's ideals, but the journey to self-discovery wasn't going to be easy. He couldn't just wake up and become someone else. And as much as it frustrated him to admit it, he knew that if there was anyone who could help him figure out who he could be, it was Selina. But how could he reach her? How could he make her see that he was trying to change, that he was trying to be better? For a few days, he did what he always did. Buried himself in work. His schedule was packed with meetings and business deals, but every moment in between, his thoughts strayed back to her, to Selina. He couldn't get her out of his mind. He would be sitting in his office, going over a report, and suddenly her face would flash in front of him. Her calm eyes, her unwavering confidence. Her presence seemed to fill every corner of his mind, as if she had become a constant companion, whether he wanted her there or not. He knew that he had to find a way to speak with her again. But this time, it couldn't just be a passing conversation. This time, he wanted to truly talk to her, to let her know that he was willing to listen, to learn. But how could he do that? She wasn't someone who would easily be swayed by his wealth or his status. She had made it clear in their last meeting that she didn't care about that. She had asked him what he wanted to be remembered for. But in the silence that followed, she had shown him that it wasn't enough to simply throw money at a problem and walk away feeling good about it. He needed to do more, and that terrified him. After what felt like an eternity of indecision, Alexander finally reached out to Selina. He had heard through the grapevine that she would be speaking at a conference on social justice and equality, something that had been arranged months in advance. The timing felt almost too perfect. It was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. He had the power to attend any event, to walk into any room. But this felt different. This wasn't about his usual game of networking. This was about connecting with someone on a deeper level. And for the first time, he was nervous. He wasn't sure why, but he found himself pacing in his penthouse before the conference, questioning whether it was too soon, whether it would be too forward. But in the end, he pushed his doubts aside and made the decision. He would attend. And he would speak to her. He would find a way to show her that he was ready to listen. When the day finally arrived, Alexander stood in the back of the conference hall, watching Selina as she took the stage. She stood there, poised and calm, her presence commanding the room without needing to raise her voice. He watched as she spoke with conviction about the racial disparities that plagued their society, the systemic issues that kept people like her and so many others at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder. She spoke about the importance of education, of providing opportunities for those who had been marginalized, and of the need for genuine, lasting change. Her words were powerful, each one hitting him like a punch to the gut. He had heard these things before, of course. He was no stranger to the topics of inequality and social justice. But hearing them from her, hearing them spoken with such honesty and raw emotion, made him realize just how much he had ignored. It made him feel like a fraud, standing there in his expensive suit, listening to a woman who had dedicated her life to causes that had never once entered his thoughts. As she spoke, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of shame, the kind of shame that made him want to crawl into a hole and never come out. But at the same time, there was something else growing inside of him, a desire to understand, a desire to be better. After her speech, there was a brief moment when the crowd dispersed for a break. This was his chance. He pushed through the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest, and found himself standing in front of her. She looked at him, but there was no surprise in her eyes. It was as though she had been expecting him, as though she knew this moment would come. "Mr. Knight," she said, her voice warm yet cautious, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I couldn't stay away," he replied, his voice low but sincere. There was a vulnerability in his tone that he couldn't hide, and for once he didn't care. "I wanted to hear you speak. I wanted to hear your thoughts on what's going on in this world." Selina raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by his admission. "Is that so?" she asked, crossing her arms as she regarded him. "And what exactly did you think of what I had to say?" I think I've been blind," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I've spent so much of my life focusing on business, on building my empire, that I've ignored the real problems that people like you, people like so many others, face every day. I've been living in a bubble, and I don't want to do that anymore. I want to learn. I want to understand. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." Selina looked at him for a long moment, as if searching his face for any signs of insincerity. But all she saw was the genuine remorse in his eyes. "It's not enough to just want to learn," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with an underlying urgency. "You have to act. You have to do something. Words are meaningless unless they're followed by action. And action is what this world needs, the kind of action that creates really lasting change." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent his life building something that people admired, but what good was it if it didn't make a real difference? He realized that she was right. He had been talking the talk, but he had never truly walked the walk. He had been using his power to maintain the status quo, to keep things comfortable for himself and others like him. But it wasn't enough anymore. Selina had shown him that. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know it's not enough, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Selina studied him for a long time before she spoke again. "I don't know if you can change, Alexander," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "But if you're serious about it, then show me. Show me that you're willing to fight for something greater than yourself. Show me that you're ready to be part of something bigger than your empire." Her challenge hung in the air between them, and for the first time in a long while, Alexander felt a sense of clarity. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was willing to fight for it. And just like that, something inside him clicked. This was only the beginning. The week after the conference felt like a blur to Alexander. He couldn't remember the exact moments that passed by, only the feeling of urgency that filled every waking second. Selina's words, the challenge she had placed before him, were etched in his mind like a permanent mark, a constant reminder that if he truly wanted to change, he couldn't merely pretend. He had to act, and that thought filled him with a mixture of excitement and dread. He had never been one for half measures, and the road ahead seemed daunting, full of questions he couldn't yet answer. What exactly did change look like? What actions could he take that would even make a dent in the deeply entrenched systems of inequality? Could someone like him, a product of privilege and wealth, ever truly understand the depth of the struggle others faced? Selina had challenged him to be part of the solution, but he had no clear vision of how to achieve that. The more he thought about it, the more overwhelming the task seemed. But there was one thing he knew. He couldn't back down now. There was no turning back. He spent the next few days doing something he hadn't done in years, listening to voices he had ignored or dismissed, tuning into stories he had never bothered to hear. He began reading books, articles, and essays on racism, inequality, and social justice. He subscribed to podcasts, watched documentaries, and attended local community meetings. Each new piece of information only added to the weight of what he was learning, but it also fueled his determination to do better. His mind, once focused solely on business and profit margins, was now preoccupied with the voices of those who had been marginalized, those who had been silenced for far too long. The more he listened, the more he understood the depth of the problem, and the more he realized how little he had done to address it. But amid all the new knowledge, there was one constant. Selina. Her face lingered in his thoughts, her words echoing in his head. He had never met anyone like her before. She was confident, unafraid to speak truth to power, and yet there was something in her that was patient, kind, and unwavering in her belief that change was possible. It was in her eyes, in the way she spoke about the future, that made him believe it too. He had always seen himself as someone who could fix things, who could create solutions, but for the first time in his life, he understood that it wasn't about fixing. It was about unlearning the things that had been ingrained in him, the ideologies he had carried for far too long. It was about being vulnerable enough to acknowledge that he had been wrong, and having the courage to do something about it. And he knew, deep down, that he couldn't do it alone. The urge to reach out to her again became almost unbearable. He needed to speak to her, to get her perspective on the journey he was just beginning. But he couldn't just approach her as the Alexander Knight people knew. Cold, calculating, and always in control. He had to approach her as the person he was now becoming. Flawed, questioning, willing to learn. And so, one evening, he found himself standing outside a small community center in a part of the city he'd never visited before. The building was modest, with a sign that read Community Outreach Program in bold letters. It was the kind of place Alexander had always looked down on, thinking it was insignificant, not realizing how crucial it was to the lives of the people who lived nearby. But now, as he stood there, his hands trembling slightly, he understood that this was where real change began. Not in the polished boardrooms or the luxury of his penthouse, but in the places where people fought for survival every day. And for the first time, he felt a deep sense of humility. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. There were children running around, playing games, while adults gathered in small circles, having passionate discussions about how they could improve their community. It was a far cry from the sterile, corporate events he was used to attending. But there was something undeniably real about it. He scanned the room, looking for Selina, but there was no sign of her. His heart sank slightly. Had he missed her? Had she already left? Just as he was about to turn around and leave, he caught sight of her in the corner of the room, speaking with a group of women. She was laughing, her face lit up with the kind of joy that seemed so out of place in the harsh world she so often fought against. But it was real. It was genuine, and in that moment he realized that this was the woman he had been searching for. The person who had the power to change him, to teach him how to be better. He walked over to her slowly, his footsteps almost hesitant. When she saw him, her expression shifted, but only slightly. She didn't look surprised to see him, but there was a cautiousness in her eyes. Perhaps she had been expecting this moment. Perhaps not. He wasn't sure, but he didn't want to waste any more time with pleasantries. "Selina," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I know I'm not the person you thought I was, but I need you to know that I'm trying. I've been listening. I've been learning." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze unreadable. There was no judgment in her eyes, but there was something else, a quiet, almost imperceptible sadness. It was as though she could see the battle within him, the part of him that still held on to the past, and the part that was trying to break free from it. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "It's not enough to just try, Alexander," she said, her words cutting through the air. "Trying doesn't change anything. It's what you do that matters. It's the actions you take, the sacrifices you're willing to make. That's what will define you. That's what will show me that you're serious." Her words stung, but they were the truth. And for a moment, Alexander felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in years. He had been living in a world where actions spoke louder than words. But here, in this community, words meant something. They carried weight. And if he was going to earn her trust, he had to do more than just say the right things. He had to prove it. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I will prove it to you. I'll prove it to myself." Selina nodded, her expression softening ever so slightly. "We'll see," she replied, before turning back to the group of women she had been speaking with. For Alexander, it felt like a door had just opened, a door to something he couldn't yet fully comprehend, but knew he had to walk through. He wasn't sure what it would take to prove himself to Selina, to show her that he was ready for real change. But he knew this. He would do whatever it took. And for the first time in his life, the weight of that commitment didn't feel like a burden. It felt like freedom. Days turned into weeks, and as time passed, Alexander found himself more deeply immersed in the community efforts. Yet something was still missing. A feeling of connection, a deeper understanding that he could only get by walking alongside those who lived these realities every day. He had attended more meetings, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't surrounded by people seeking to profit from each other or play games. Instead, there were faces filled with determination and hope, people who were willing to invest in the future despite the many obstacles stacked against them. But with each encounter, he realized just how far removed he had been from this world. The challenges, the struggle, it was real. He had only been observing from the outside, never truly living it. And as much as his new knowledge shook him, as much as he tried to change, the weight of his past still loomed over him. He was a product of a society that rewarded the privileged and punished the marginalized. The truth he couldn't ignore now was how difficult it would be to truly make a difference. It was so easy to throw money at a cause, to donate to charity events, to pretend to care. But the deeper, rawer work was not in the donations. It was in the actions that demanded sacrifice, vulnerability, and a willingness to lose something that mattered. Selina had told him actions speak louder than words, and those words kept circling around in his mind, spinning until he realized that every step he took towards real change felt like walking in quicksand. Each time he thought he was moving forward, the past seemed to grab him, pulling him back to the man he used to be, cold, indifferent, calculated. But this time, something inside him refused to go back. Every time he found himself slipping, he would think of her, Selina, and the fire she carried, the quiet strength with which she fought for those whose voices had been stifled for far too long. She had seen his potential for change before he ever did, and that vision had been both inspiring and terrifying. He had never thought of himself as someone capable of great change. He was a businessman, not a social justice warrior. But her belief in him had sparked something he couldn't ignore. And now it was burning within him, pushing him to act, to be better, to do more. And so, when he received an invitation from Selena to attend a community outreach event she was hosting, he didn't hesitate. He knew it wasn't going, lit up with the kind of joy that seemed so out of place in the harsh world she so often fought against. But it was real. It was genuine. And in that moment, he realized that this was the woman he had been searching for. The person who had the power to change him, to teach him how to be better. He walked over to her slowly, his footsteps almost hesitant. When she saw him, her expression shifted, but only slightly. She didn't look surprised to see him, but there was a cautiousness in her eyes. Perhaps she had been expecting this moment. Perhaps not. He wasn't sure, but he didn't want to waste any more time with pleasantries. "Selena," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I know I'm not the person you thought I was, but I need you to know that I'm trying. I've been listening. I've been learning." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze unreadable. There was no judgment in her eyes, but there was something else, a quiet, almost imperceptible sadness. It was as though she could see the battle within him, the part of him that still held on to the past, and the part that was trying to break free from it. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "It's not enough to just try, Alexander," she said, her words cutting through the air. "Trying doesn't change anything. It's what you do that matters. It's the actions you take, the sacrifices you're willing to make. That's what will define you. That's what will show me that you're serious." Her words stung, but they were the truth. And for a moment, Alexander felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in years. He had been living in a world where actions spoke louder than words. But here, in this community, words meant something. They carried weight. And if he was going to earn her trust, he had to do more than just say the right things. He had to prove it. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I will prove it to you. I'll prove it to myself." Selena nodded, her expression softening ever so slightly. "We'll see," she replied, before turning back to the group of women she had been speaking with. For Alexander, it felt like a door had just opened, a door to something he couldn't yet fully comprehend, but knew he had to walk through. He wasn't sure what it would take to prove himself to Selena, to show her that he was ready for real change. But he knew this. He would do whatever it took. And for the first time in his life, the weight of that commitment didn't feel like a burden. It felt like freedom. Days turned into weeks, and as time passed, Alexander found himself more deeply immersed in the community efforts. Yet something was still missing. A feeling of connection, a deeper understanding that he could only get by walking alongside those who lived these realities every day. He had attended more meetings, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't surrounded by people seeking to profit from each other or play games. Instead, there were faces filled with determination and hope, people who were willing to invest in the future despite the many obstacles stacked against them. But with each encounter, he realized just how far removed he had been from this world. The challenges, the struggle, it was real. He had only been observing from the outside, never truly living it. And as much as his new knowledge shook him, as much as he tried to change, the weight of his past still loomed over him. He was a product of a society that rewarded the privileged and punished the marginalized. The truth he couldn't ignore now was how difficult it would be to truly make a difference. It was so easy to throw money at a cause, to donate to charity events, to pretend to care. But the deeper, rawer work was not in the donations. It was in the actions that demanded sacrifice, vulnerability, and a willingness to lose something that mattered. Selina had told him actions speak louder than words, and those words kept circling around in his mind, spinning until he realized that every step he took towards real change felt like walking in quicksand. Each time he thought he was moving forward, the past seemed to grab him, pulling him back to the man he used to be, cold, indifferent, calculated. But this time, something inside him refused to go back. Every time he found himself slipping, he would think of her, Selina, and the fire she carried, the quiet strength with which she fought for those whose voices had been stifled for far too long. She had seen his potential for change before he ever did, and that vision had been both inspiring and terrifying. He had never thought of himself as someone capable of great change. He was a businessman, not a social justice warrior. But her belief in him had sparked something he couldn't ignore, and now it was burning within him, pushing him to act, to be better, to do more. And so, when he received an invitation from Selena to attend a community outreach event she was hosting, he didn't hesitate. He knew it wasn't going to be another polite gathering with handshakes and surface-level discussions. This was going to be real. This was going to be raw. And for the first time, Alexander didn't want to hide from it. The event was taking place in an old part of the city, a place he had driven past countless times, but never had any reason to stop. The buildings were worn down, their facades marked by the passage of time, the evidence of a city that had forgotten its own people. Yet, in the midst of all the decay, there was life. There were children running around, laughter echoing off the walls, and families gathering, supporting one another in a way Alexander had never witnessed before. The disparity was staggering. This was the reality of those he had once looked down on, and the starkness of it hit him like a punch to the stomach. His own world of glass towers, marble floors, and golden offices seemed so distant now, so irrelevant. Selina was there, of course. She was speaking with the community members, her words filled with warmth and empathy, yet also the sharp clarity of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. She was every bit as powerful as he remembered, but this time there was no distance between them. She wasn't some distant ideal, and he wasn't just some billionaire who had come to check off a box. They were both standing on common ground now, united by the need to create real change. As Alexander approached her, his heart pounded in his chest, an unfamiliar vulnerability seizing him. For the first time, he was afraid, not of business deals or market trends, but of failing her. He had promised her that he would prove himself, that he would be different, and every part of him wanted to honor that promise. But how could he? How could someone like him, with all his privilege and history, really understand what it meant to be part of the solution? "Selina," he said, his voice steady, but carrying a weight he couldn't shake. "I'm here to help. I'm ready. I want to be part of this. Whatever it takes." She looked at him, her eyes scanning his face with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "I'm glad you're here, Alexander," she replied, her tone soft yet measured. "But remember, Words are easy. Proving that you're serious is what matters. Her words stung, but he didn't flinch. Instead, they fueled his resolve. I know. I'm not here to make empty promises. I want to do the hard work. I want to be held accountable. Selina nodded, then gestured for him to follow her as she moved through the crowd. They passed by tables where food was being distributed, families lining up for the support they needed, and children who had no idea what it meant to go hungry. But there was something different in the air, a sense of togetherness, of people leaning on each other. He realized that what had once seemed like hopelessness was actually a community built on resilience, and that resilience was something he wanted to be a part of. As they moved into a quieter part of the event, Selina turned to him. "This is where it gets real, Alexander," she said. "It's easy to talk about change. It's easy to show up at events and look good. But it's not enough. You're stepping into something bigger than you've ever known. And if you're truly serious, you have to start with this. Learning to listen and learning to understand the struggles that people here face every single day." He nodded, taking in every word. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be a simple fix. But for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like someone who could, perhaps, make a difference. There was a shift happening within him, subtle but unmistakable, like the unfreezing of a long locked door. He was learning what it meant to truly listen, not just with his ears, but with his heart. And he realized that the walls he had built around himself, those walls of privilege, arrogance, and fear, were finally starting to crack. He wasn't sure how or when, but he knew that with Selina's guidance, he could help rebuild something far greater than what he had ever imagined. In that moment, standing there with Selina, surrounded by people who had fought for their right to be heard, Alexander understood. Real change wasn't about winning battles. It was about dismantling the systems that made those battles necessary in the first place. It was about standing in solidarity with those who had been ignored for far too long. And as he looked at Selina, her calm strength, her unwavering conviction, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking this path alone. He had a long way to go, but he had taken the first step, and that, in itself, was everything. The days that followed Selina's invitation were a blur of activity for Alexander, each one moving faster than the last, each one forcing him further into a world he had never truly considered. But the more he immersed himself in these experiences, the more the walls inside him seemed to crack. There were times when he'd catch himself wondering what had driven him to this point, the same drive that had led him to build his empire. And yet now, it seemed like that very empire was a cage, trapping him in a life that was more about power than people. The reality of what Selina had said about learning to listen, about understanding the true depth of inequality and suffering, began to take root in his heart. Every conversation he had with community members, every look he shared with those struggling just to get by, brought him closer to an understanding of how deeply systemic the issues were, and how much harder the road would be than he'd initially imagined. This was no longer about fixing problems with money or using influence to make a difference from a distance. It was about real, raw change, about showing up in ways that truly mattered. And Alexander was beginning to realize that to do this, he couldn't rely on his old tactics or his old mindset. He couldn't just throw money at the issue and hope it would disappear. There was no quick fix. no magic solution. The work required patience, compassion, and above all, honesty. He was going to have to confront his own prejudices, his own past, and break free from the ideologies that had once shaped him into the man he used to be. His relationship with Selena, which had begun with the cool detachment of a business transaction, was slowly transforming into something far more personal. Their conversations, once filled with tense negotiations and guarded words, had become more open, more vulnerable. She no longer saw him as just another powerful billionaire with a plan to save the world from the top down. She saw him as someone who was struggling to do the right thing, someone who didn't have all the answers, but was willing to learn. And for Alexander, that shift was both humbling and terrifying. The man who had once prided himself on his ability to control every situation was now faced with a challenge that required him to surrender, to admit that he didn't know everything, and that sometimes the best course of action was simply to listen, to understand, and to act from a place of true empathy. One late afternoon, as the city began to bathe in the warm glow of a fading sunset, Selena invited him to attend a meeting at a local church. It wasn't a place he would have ever chosen to visit on his own, but he trusted her now, more than he ever thought he could. It was a community meeting for families who had been affected by violence, loss, and systemic neglect. The church, though humble in structure, was filled with people who carried heavy burdens, but also an undeniable sense of hope. As he stepped into the room, the sound of quiet murmurs filled the air. People sat in small circles, some in tears, others holding hands in solidarity. It was nothing like the corporate meetings he was used to. There were no polished suits, no sleek technology. There was just the raw, unfiltered emotion of people who had lived through more than most could imagine. For a moment, he felt out of place, as if his presence alone was an intrusion. But Selena, as always, was there beside him, guiding him, reminding him that he wasn't here to save them. He was here to stand with them. As the meeting began, a woman in the group stood up to share her story. She spoke of her son, a young man who had been caught in the crossfire of a gang dispute, and how her family had been left broken by the loss. Alexander listened, his heart heavy with each word. He had heard of tragedies like this before, read about them in news stories, but hearing it from someone's personal experience, the pain, the anger, the grief, it hit him like a tidal wave. He had been so far removed from the reality of everyday people's struggles, and yet here, in this room, surrounded by the raw emotion of those who'd been affected by systemic violence and injustice, he couldn't escape the gravity of it. Every word from the woman's lips felt like a direct challenge to everything he had ever known. His wealth, his power, his status, they meant nothing here. They didn't shield him from the truth that he was just one man, with one life, and no amount of money could undo the damage that had been done to the families in this room. When the woman finished speaking, there was a long silence, broken only by the sound of soft sniffles and the occasional sigh. Alexander could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, and for a moment he was paralyzed. He wanted to do something, to offer a solution, to fix the pain. But he knew better now. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a donation or a few kind words. This was about creating long-term change, about addressing the root causes of violence and inequality that ran deep through the fabric of society. It was about challenging the systems that allowed such suffering to exist in the first place. And in that moment, Alexander understood the scale of the challenge he had set before himself. It wasn't enough to show up and offer sympathy. He had to be willing to take action, to make real sacrifices, and to fight for a world where stories like this were no longer the norm. Later that evening, as the meeting came to a close, Selina turned to him. "You see, Alexander," she said quietly, her voice laced with a mixture of hope and sorrow, "this is the work. This is where it starts. It starts with people like her, with families like this. We can't ignore their pain anymore. We have to do something." Alexander nodded, his throat tight, his heart heavy. He was no longer the man he had been when he first met Selina. He had entered this world with an arrogance he hadn't even known he possessed, thinking he could swoop in and fix things with money or influence. But now he understood. Real change was about more than resources. It was about showing up with your whole self, ready to learn, ready to listen, and most importantly, ready to fight for those who had been left behind. Selina had given him a glimpse into a world he had never truly seen before. And as painful as that had been, it was also the most enlightening thing that had ever happened to him. As they walked back to the car, the weight of the evening's experience hung heavily between them. But there was also a sense of quiet understanding. He was no longer just a man with a business empire. He was part of something larger now, something that required more of him than he had ever imagined. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this path, this journey, wasn't just about fixing the world. It was about fixing himself, about confronting the ugliness inside him that had allowed him to stay blind for so long. And as he looked at Selina, standing beside him with a quiet strength, he realized that no matter how difficult this journey became, he wasn't walking it alone. The next morning, as Alexander walked out of his apartment and into the cool morning air, something inside him felt heavier than it ever had before. The sun was barely rising, casting a golden hue over the city that seemed to mock the turmoil he felt within himself. His life had changed in ways he couldn't have predicted. In the months since he met Selina, he had begun to understand the vast chasm that existed between his world and the one she inhabited. But it wasn't just the difference in the worlds they had come from. It was the stark realization that for all his wealth and power, he had been blind to the daily struggles of so many people, and that blindness had caused harm in ways he had never fully grasped until now. He knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but he also knew he couldn't turn back. Selina had shown him a reality he could no longer ignore. Every conversation, every moment spent with her, had slowly peeled back the layers of arrogance and indifference that had once defined him. It had made him question everything: his beliefs, his past actions, and his place in a world that was desperately in need of change. As he sat in the back of his car, heading toward another meeting, he thought about the people he had met, the families who had lost loved ones to senseless violence, the children who had been born into systems that seemed designed to keep them down, and the communities that had been overlooked for generations. The pain was palpable, the injustice inescapable. But what weighed most heavily on Alexander's mind was his growing sense of responsibility. He had spent his life accumulating wealth, building an empire, and securing his place in the world. But now he realized none of it mattered in the face of the suffering that surrounded him. The more he learned, the more he wanted to do, but the more daunting it became. How could one person possibly make a difference in a system so deeply entrenched in inequality and division? He was just one man, after all. Selina's words from the meeting echoed in his mind. Actions speak louder than words. You can't just show up and think that's enough. You have to be willing to change yourself before you can change anything else. That weight of those words, the truth they carried, lingered in his chest like a heavy stone, pressing him down with each passing day. But despite the challenge, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that this was the work he was meant to do, that the path he was on, though fraught with difficulty, was the one that would define the rest of his life. There were moments of doubt, moments when he questioned whether he was truly capable of this kind of change. But then he would think of Selina and the quiet resolve in her eyes. She believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself, and that belief had sparked something deep inside of him that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't about seeking approval or redemption from anyone else. It was about finding a purpose that was bigger than himself. The first step was acknowledging the privilege he had taken for granted, and the second was realizing the power of that privilege to either perpetuate the systems of oppression or to dismantle them. But how could he begin? What was the first real step toward making a meaningful change? His thoughts were interrupted as his car pulled into the parking lot of a community center in one of the city's most impoverished neighborhoods. The building was old, the windows cracked, the exterior worn down by years of neglect. But as he walked through the doors, he was met with a warmth and a sense of unity that he hadn't expected. This was the kind of place that Selina had been working to support, the heart of the community, where families gathered, where people didn't just survive, but thrived in the face of adversity. It was here, among the people who had nothing but each other to rely on, that he began to see the kind of strength that was born not from wealth or power, but from resilience, from the will to keep going even when the world seemed stacked against you. As he entered the main room, he saw families sitting together, children running around, and a group of volunteers working to distribute food and supplies. And now there was a buzz in the air, a sense of purpose that reminded Alexander of the early days of his business career, when everything had been about creating something that would change the world. But this wasn't about money or status. This was about community, about standing together to fight for a better future. It was about using whatever resources you had to uplift those who had been left behind. He stood at the entrance for a moment, taking it all in. He was no longer the cold, ruthless businessman who had walked into this world with a sense of entitlement. He had become something different, someone who understood the depth of the work that lay ahead, and who was ready to fight for the change that was so desperately needed. As Selina walked over to him, a smile tugged at her lips, though there was an unreadable emotion in her eyes. "You're here," she said, her voice warm, but laced with an underlying seriousness. "I knew you'd show up. You've been changing more than just your business strategies, haven't you?" He nodded, unsure of what to say. His heart was heavy with the realization that there was so much more to be done. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand what it meant to truly be part of the solution. The work wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about showing up, being willing to learn, and taking responsibility for the actions that had brought him to this point. As the day wore on, Alexander found himself immersed in conversations with community members, each of them sharing their stories, their dreams, and their struggles. There were moments of laughter, moments of pain, but through it all, there was an undeniable sense of unity, of people coming together to create something that could not be broken. It was a far cry from the corporate boardrooms he had once dominated, and yet, in many ways, it was more fulfilling than anything he had ever experienced. By the time the sun set, casting a golden glow over the city, Alexander knew that he was on the right path. It would be a long and difficult journey, one that would challenge him in ways he couldn't yet imagine, but for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. This was where he was meant to be, and no matter what it took, he was going to fight for the change that was long overdue. The day everything changed began with a single photo. It was a candid shot, taken by a bystander at the community center. Alexander had been standing alongside Selina, the two of them laughing, surrounded by children, their faces lit up with joy. It was nothing more than an innocent moment of connection between two people from very different worlds. Yet to the outside world, it became something far more dangerous. By midday, the photo had gone viral. It spread like wildfire across social media, fueling a firestorm of anger and vitriol. The comments that followed were not just about Alexander's involvement with Selina. It was about the very fact that a white billionaire, someone of his power and status, had dared to be seen with a black woman. The messages flooded in, filled with racial slurs, threats of violence, and calls for Alexander's immediate removal from his position. The hate was relentless. The people who had once viewed him as an untouchable symbol of success now saw him as a traitor to his race, a man who had fallen too far from the pedestal he had built. It was clear to Alexander that the world had drawn a line in the sand, and he had crossed it in a way that he couldn't undo. At first, Alexander was stunned. He hadn't anticipated this. He hadn't even known the depths of hatred that still existed, simmering beneath the surface of the world he had lived in, a world of wealth and privilege that shielded him from the raw realities of life outside his empire. His mind raced with questions. How had it all gone so wrong? Why were people so angry? Was it really as simple as the color of Selina's skin? As the day wore on, the pressure mounted. His phone rang incessantly, emails flooded his inbox, and his assistant was no longer able to keep up with the deluge of requests from the media, the board, and concerned investors. Every conversation seemed to center around the same issue: his association with Selina, Alexander's grandfather, the man who had raised him with the belief that his bloodline was pure, his legacy untouchable, was among the first to publicly denounce him. He had always prided himself on his traditional values, values that, as far as he was concerned, were under direct threat from Alexander's behavior. The family name was sacred, and Alexander's willingness to tarnish it by associating with someone of Selina's background was unforgivable in his eyes. The press conference he held later that evening, addressing the scandal, was filled with sharp condemnation, his words dripping with disgust. "My grandson has abandoned the principles on which this family was built," he declared, his voice icy and unforgiving. "He has brought shame upon us, and I will not stand for it." The words stung, more than anything Alexander had expected. They felt like a betrayal, a public execution of his character. The weight of his grandfather's disappointment felt heavier than the mounting pressure from the board, from his investors, from the millions of people who now saw him as a symbol of weakness. But the worst was yet to come. Late that evening, as Alexander sat in his office trying to formulate a response, a call came in from Selina's phone. His heart dropped when he answered and heard a voice on the other end that wasn't hers. It was frantic, filled with panic. "Mr. Knight, this is Jared, Selina's friend. She's been attacked. Some men, they came after her. They hurt her." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. "What do you mean, hurt her?" he demanded, his voice trembling. They were thugs. I don't know who they were, but they had guns. They beat her up, Mr. Knight. She's in the hospital right now." Jared's voice cracked as he spoke, and Alexander felt his entire world begin to unravel. Without wasting a second, he rushed to the hospital, his mind spinning with images of Selina, hurt, scared, alone, and the realization that this was his fault. The photo? The scandal? It had opened a door that led to something far darker than he had ever imagined. As he entered the emergency room, his heart pounded in his chest. He didn't care about his reputation anymore, didn't care about the board, or the angry messages, or the threats. All that mattered was Selina. The doctors had stabilized her, but the sight of her lying unconscious in that sterile hospital bed, bruised and battered, nearly broke him. Her face was swollen, her body bruised, and the sense of helplessness he felt was overwhelming. She had been targeted because of him, because of the choices he had made, and it tore him apart. He knelt beside her, his hand brushing her hair back from her face, as if doing so could somehow make everything right. "Selina," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." His words felt hollow, empty in the face of what she had endured, and he knew that no apology, no matter how sincere, could undo the harm that had been done. The police arrived shortly after, asking questions about the attack, about any possible suspects. But it was clear to Alexander that this was no random act of violence. This was orchestrated. The men who had attacked Selina weren't just thugs. They were linked to his business rivals, people who had always seen him as a threat, people who wanted to see him brought down. The realization hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. His empire had created enemies, and now they were using the very thing he had tried to protect, the woman he cared for, as a weapon against him. As he stood there, watching Selina fight to stay alive, he realized something even more painful. His entire life had been a lie. The empire he had built, the wealth he had accumulated, it had all been a facade, built on the backs of others. It had never truly mattered, not in the way he had convinced himself it did. His heart ached as he thought of the people he had hurt, the things he had ignored in the pursuit of the power. He had let his ego, his need for control, blind him to everything that truly mattered. And now, it was too late. The damage was done, and no amount of money or influence could undo the hurt. Selina's eyes fluttered open a few hours later, and the relief that washed over him was almost too much to bear. "Selina," he breathed, squeezing her hand, desperate for her to know he was there, that he hadn't abandoned her. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment she smiled, her face still pale, but her spirit unbroken. "You're here," she whispered, her voice weak but warm. "I knew you would be." The words hit him harder than he had anticipated. Despite everything that had happened, despite the violence, the hate, she still believed in him. And that, more than anything, filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He wouldn't stop fighting. He couldn't. Not for her, and not for the world they both wanted to change. The hospital room was quiet. But in that stillness, Alexander made a vow. The world had tried to break him, tried to break them both, but it would not win. He would take the fall, face the consequences of his actions, and do everything in his power to protect Selena, to make things right, no matter the cost. The following days felt like a blur to Alexander. He barely slept, his mind a storm of guilt and regret, overrun with the images of Selena's battered face, the vicious backlash, and the hate that had been unleashed upon them both. The weight of it all crushed him, suffocating him with each passing hour. His world, once built on power and control, now felt like a crumbling house of cards. For the first time in his life, Alexander could no longer hide behind the armor of wealth, privilege, and status. He could no longer pretend to be the man he once thought he was, the man his grandfather had taught him to be. Everything he had known, everything he had believed, had been shattered. And in the midst of it all, one truth emerged. He could not undo what had been done. But he could try to make things right. The press conference was set for noon, the room packed with reporters, cameras, and expectant faces. As Alexander stood at the podium, the weight of the moment pressed heavily upon him. His reputation, his family name, the empire he had built. It all hung in the balance. The eyes of the world were upon him, ready to watch his downfall. But for the first time, he didn't care about the consequences. His focus was on one thing: redemption. He looked out at the sea of journalists, took a deep breath, and began. I stand before you today, not as the man I once was, but as someone who is finally facing the truth, he began, his voice steady, but laced with the deep pain he had been carrying for so long. For far too long, I have been blinded by the very privileges I was born into. I have built an empire based on a foundation of inequality, on the backs of those I failed to see as human beings, people like Selena Moore and so many others who have been oppressed, marginalized, and disenfranchised. His voice wavered as he spoke, but he forced himself to continue. This was no longer about protecting his legacy or his wealth. It was about confronting the ugly truths he had spent years running from. The truth is, I grew up in a world that told me I was better because of the color of my skin, that success was my birthright, and that my family's legacy was something to be revered. But I now know, after everything that's happened, that I was wrong. My father, my grandfather, both of them instilled in me beliefs that are not just outdated, but harmful. I have perpetuated a system of racism, both knowingly and unknowingly. I have allowed this company, this empire, to thrive on the backs of people who were treated as less than. I have failed to see their humanity. I have failed to see how the world truly works for so many, and for that, I am deeply sorry. The room was silent as his words hung in the air, the reporters stunned into a rare moment of quiet. Alexander's chest tightened, but he pressed on, the weight of his confession filling him with a sense of clarity he had never felt before. I cannot erase my past, he continued, but I can take responsibility for it. And that's why, effective immediately, I am resigning as the CEO of Knight Corp. The company will be turning over control to a diverse board of leaders who understand the struggles and challenges that people like Selina have faced their entire lives. The leadership of this company will no longer be defined by the same old patterns of inequality. It will be led by those who are committed to justice, to equity, and to building a future where everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed. The reporters murmured, the shock in the room palpable. But Alexander was not finished. His hands shook slightly as he took out a piece of paper, his mind racing with what needed to come next. "I am also announcing today the creation of a massive reparative fund," he said, his voice growing stronger. "This fund will be dedicated to reparations for those who have been most harmed by the systems of racism and injustice, both within and outside of Night Corp. It will support initiatives aimed at closing the wealth gap, addressing racial inequality, and providing the resources necessary to empower marginalized communities. I know that money alone will not fix the harm that has been done, but it is a step, and it is a necessary one." He paused, letting the words sink in. The room was still in shock, but Alexander could feel a shift that, though small, was undeniable. It was the first step toward something greater, something more meaningful than anything he had ever achieved. "And to that end," he continued, his voice now firm, "I will be personally donating my entire fortune to racial justice initiatives. This includes substantial contributions to the very community centers and organizations that are working tirelessly to make a difference. One of those organizations will be Selina Moore's center, the one she has been fighting for since the beginning. I can never undo the harm that has been done to her, to so many others, but I will dedicate the rest of my life to ensuring that the work she has started continues and thrives." There was a moment of stunned silence as the reporters processed his words. Alexander felt his heart pounding in his chest, but for the first time, it wasn't from fear or anxiety. It was from a sense of relief. He had made his decision. He had chosen the right path, even if it was one that would cost him everything. "I know that these actions will not make up for the years of pain and suffering that have come before," he said softly, his voice breaking slightly as he looked into the cameras. "But I will spend the rest of my life fighting for change. I will fight for justice. I will fight for equality. And I will fight for the future that people like Selina Moore deserve." As he finished speaking, Alexander stepped back from the podium, the room filling with questions and hushed whispers. The world had been stunned by his words, but there was something else in the air, a shift, a possibility. The road ahead would not be easy. He would face backlash from those who had once supported him, from the investors, from the media, and from his family. But Alexander had never been more certain of his path. The reckoning had come, and with it, a chance for redemption. Later that day, as Alexander sat in his office one last time, he looked out the window, a strange peace settling over him. He had given up everything, his title, his wealth, his power. But in doing so, he had gained something far more valuable. He had found his purpose. And as he thought of Selina, her kindness, her strength, her unwavering belief in the possibility of change, he knew that together they would build something that mattered. The fight for racial justice was just beginning, but Alexander Knight was no longer the man he used to be. He was ready to face the fight, to stand alongside those who had been left behind for far too long, and to ensure that their voices would finally be heard. Months had passed since the press conference. The chaotic storm that had once threatened to drown Alexander Knight had slowly faded into the background. The world had moved on. But for Alexander, the process of healing, of becoming someone better, someone worthy of redemption, was just beginning. He had relinquished his title as CEO, his wealth, and all the symbols of his old life. He had stepped away from the golden cage that had once defined him, leaving behind the corporate empire, the mansion, the high-profile circles that had made him a household name. Instead, he found himself in a quiet, modest apartment, tucked away from the prying eyes of the world. He now worked anonymously at the youth center that Selina had founded, no longer the arrogant billionaire CEO, but a man with a purpose that was simple, yet profound. Every morning he showed up early, working alongside the other volunteers, helping the children with their homework, playing basketball with them, and quietly learning what it truly meant to live a life of humility and service. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was real. It was a life without the trappings of wealth and power, and for the first time, it felt right. He no longer cared about being in the spotlight. What mattered was the impact he could make on the lives of the young people in the center, who had never been afforded the privileges he had taken for granted for so long. Though the weight of his actions still lingered on his shoulders, Alexander was at peace with his new life. It was the first step toward redemption, toward becoming someone he could respect. Yet, as much as he had transformed his external world, there was still a gaping chasm within him. It was the one thing he could not fix with money or good deeds: Selina. Selina had forgiven him. That was something Alexander was deeply grateful for. Yet it wasn't the simple, easy forgiveness he had once hoped for. It was far more complicated than that. Selina had shown him mercy, but she had also made it clear that forgiveness didn't mean everything was okay. She had been hurt by him in ways that no apology could erase. She had been betrayed, both by the man she had once trusted and by the world around her. It wasn't just about the attack on her. It wasn't just about the systemic injustice he had failed to see. It was about all the ways Alexander had once used his power to keep people like her, people of color, down, without even realizing it. She had made it clear that she couldn't simply erase the scars he had left on her. Her forgiveness was not a free pass. It was something she had to work through, something they both had to rebuild slowly, piece by piece. She wasn't willing to rush the process, and that was something Alexander came to understand, something that humbled him deeply. He saw the way she looked at him sometimes, careful, cautious, as if measuring every word, every action. She was no longer the wide-eyed, trusting woman who had once believed in him without question. That woman had been shattered, and now only a wiser, more guarded version of Selina remained. Alexander respected that. He had no right to expect anything from her. All he could do was show her, through every action, that he was changing, that he was learning, that he was trying desperately to become the man she could trust again. Their relationship, if it could even be called that, was now built on a foundation of hard-earned trust. They spoke openly, but it was always a slow and cautious conversation. One step forward, 2 steps back. Alexander had given her space. He knew that trust, once broken, wasn't easily restored. Every time they spent together, Every time she allowed him to help her, to be by her side, he felt like he was being given a small piece of grace. But he also knew there was still a long road ahead. There would be days when the pain of the past would resurface for both of them, when the ghosts of his mistakes would haunt them. But those days, when they came, were moments for growth, not defeat. Then, one quiet evening, when the air was cool and the center was winding down for the night, Alexander found himself standing in the hallway outside of Selina's office. He had spent months trying to find the right way to express the feelings that had slowly grown within him. Feelings of profound respect, gratitude, and yes, love. He didn't have a grand gesture to offer her, not a ring or a spectacular display of wealth. He had given up all of that. What he did have was something much more important: a letter. The letter wasn't a proposal in the traditional sense. There were no diamonds, no romantic speeches, no promises of eternal love that could somehow be measured by material means. Instead, Alexander's letter was an honest confession of everything he had learned in the months since they'd begun to rebuild their connection. It was a letter that detailed all the ways he had changed, all the ways he had come to understand the world in a way he never had before. It spoke of his dedication to her, not just as a partner, but as a woman who had shown him a new way to live, through love, justice, and unwavering integrity. He found her in her office, the warm light of the desk lamp casting a soft glow on her face. She looked up as he entered, her eyes studying him. He was no longer the man she had once feared, the man who had lived in a world of arrogance and privilege. This man was different, quieter, more grounded. He was no longer trying to be someone else. He was simply himself, the man who had learned to listen, to reflect, and to change. "Selena," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of sincerity that had once been foreign to him. "I don't expect anything from you, but I need you to know that I'm not the man I used to be. And I will never be that man again." She looked at him with a steady gaze, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes that softened, just a little. A glimmer of trust, perhaps. He handed her the letter. "This is for you. It's not a promise of perfection, because I'm still learning. But it's a promise that I will keep working for the rest of my life to be worthy of you, and of the future we both deserve." She took the letter from his hands, her fingers brushing his ever so slightly. There was a silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence of understanding, of two people finally reaching a place where they could acknowledge the weight of their shared history without being weighed down by it. Selina didn't immediately respond. Instead, she opened the letter, her eyes scanning the words that Alexander had written with painstaking care. As she read, Alexander could see the tension in her shoulders ease, just a fraction. When she was finished, she looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a depth of emotion that was hard to decipher. "I can't promise you anything," she said quietly. "But I can say this. You've come a long way, Alexander, and that's more than I ever thought I'd see from you." Alexander's heart swelled, a wave of gratitude washing over him. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was enough. In that moment, it was more than enough. And with that, their journey continued. Not with a ring, but with a quiet promise. A promise that they would build their future together, slowly, with patience, trust, and love. They had both come a long way, and they would continue to walk the path ahead, side by side. The sun shone down, casting a golden glow over the lush green garden where the wedding had been carefully planned. The air was warm with the scent of blooming flowers, their colors vibrant against the clear blue sky. Around them, children ran, their laughter filling the air like music, their carefree joy a stark contrast to the seriousness of the ceremony that was about to unfold. This was not the grand spectacle of a billionaire's wedding, nor the lavish affair that Alexander Knight's old life might have demanded. This was something far more meaningful, a celebration of love, a union built not on status or appearances, but on the foundation of growth, understanding, and forgiveness. Selina stood by the altar, a quiet smile on her lips, her braided hair flowing gently in the breeze. She wore a simple but stunning white dress, her beauty glowing in the soft light of the afternoon. There was no entourage, no extravagant display of wealth. Only the people who mattered most to them, the children from the center, the people they had worked beside, and a few close friends who had witnessed their journey. And then there was Alexander standing across from her, his blue eyes locked on her with a tenderness that seemed to speak volumes. He no longer wore the tailored suits of a ruthless CEO, or the arrogant confidence of a man used to having everything at his command. Instead, he stood in a simple dark suit, his posture relaxed, his heart full. He had come a long way from the man who had once built his life on hatred, arrogance, and privilege. He had earned every step of this moment, the steps of humility, of growth, and of the unwavering love he felt for the woman in front of him. As they exchanged vows, their words were simple but heartfelt, with each promise spoken between them, an acknowledgement of the challenges they had faced and the love they had found, despite the odds. They had both been through so much, but here they were, together, under the soft rays of the sun, the future shining before them. For Alexander, this wedding wasn't just a celebration of their love, it was the culmination of his journey. It was a reminder of how far that he had come, and how far he still had to go. But what mattered now was that they had made it together. And as he stood there, holding Selina's hands, his heart swelled with a love deeper than anything he had ever known. As the ceremony ended and they kissed under the cheers of their friends and family, the world around them seemed to come alive, as if nature itself were rejoicing in the love that had blossomed between them. It was a quiet, humble affair, and yet, to Alexander, it felt more powerful than anything he had ever experienced. The reception was intimate, children playing, laughter filling the air, and everyone mingling as the evening began to fall. Alexander looked around, his heart full as he watched Selina speak with the children, their faces lit up with smiles. They were no longer the awkward, uncertain strangers they had once been. They were a family now, one that had been forged in the fires of their shared struggles, their mutual growth, and the unbreakable bond they had built. But as the night wore on, there was one unexpected guest, one person who had not been invited, but whose presence could not be ignored. From across the garden, Alexander saw her, his mother. She stood near the entrance, her face pale, her expression unreadable. His heart skipped a beat. It had been years since he had seen her, and even longer since they had spoken. The relationship between them had been strained beyond repair after the years of manipulation from his father and grandfather. His mother had been disowned, cast aside, for marrying a black man, the very man who was Alexander's real father, a man Alexander had never known. He knew the truth now. The walls of hatred his family had built had hidden the truth from him for so long. He had been taught to hate, to despise anyone who didn't fit the mold his family had created. He had been raised with the belief that his worth was tied to his bloodline, his status, his race. But now he understood that those lessons had been lies, built to keep him ignorant of the real story, the real truth of his heritage. His mother's marriage had been the source of their rejection, and the truth of his own father's identity was a secret he had never known. Alexander's heart ached as he watched his mother standing there, alone, her eyes searching the crowd. She had always been the quiet strength in his life, the one person who had loved him unconditionally, even when everything else was falling apart. And yet, because of the lies of his father and grandfather, he had never known the full truth of her sacrifice, her love, and her pain. He turned to Selina, his voice barely a whisper. "That's my mother." Selina's eyes softened, her gaze following his to where his mother stood, still on the outskirts of the crowd. Without a word, she gently squeezed his hand. There was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. She had seen the man Alexander had been, and now she saw the man he had become. She had seen his struggle with the truth, the hurt of the past, and the weight of his family's legacy. But what mattered now, Selina knew, was the future. Alexander didn't know what he expected from his mother. Would she walk away? Would she confront him? Would she finally acknowledge the truth? He wasn't sure, but as he watched her, he realized that it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was finally free from the chains of hate, from the lies he had been taught. What mattered was that he had found the woman who had taught him the meaning of love, Selina. He stood up slowly and walked toward his mother, every step a reminder of the long road he had walked to get here, to this moment, to this truth. When he reached her, he didn't speak right away. Instead, he just looked at her, taking in the woman who had given him life, the woman who had been forced to hide her love for so long. Her eyes welled with tears as she looked back at him, a mixture of regret and longing in her gaze. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything." She shook her head, tears falling freely now. "No, my son, I'm the one who's sorry, for everything I couldn't protect you from, for the truth I couldn't give you." They stood there, silently, the weight of years of lost time hanging between them. And then, with a quiet understanding, Alexander reached out and pulled his mother into an embrace, the first true embrace they had shared in years. As they stood there, in the warmth of the evening, surrounded by the people who mattered, Alexander realized something he had never understood before. Love didn't need to teach, it only needed to be seen. And for the first time in his life, he finally saw it. With a final glance at Selina, who smiled at him from across the garden, Alexander knew that their journey had only just begun. But they would face it together, with love, trust, and the hope of a future where no one would ever again be taught to hate. Love doesn't need to teach, it only needs to be seen, once